church, being supportive of the church's activities.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need to aspire to be some sort of world-famous, world-influencing figure to do that. I don't need to blog. I don't need to Twitter. I need to be there on a Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if this fear of, well, if we don't blog, we won't have an impact on the wider world. Part of them will say, well, so what? Maybe you're not called to have an impact on the wider world. Maybe you're called to have an impact upon the local church where the Lord has placed you, or in the denomination where the Lord has placed you. So those are the kind of questions that I would want to raise, I think. I have fun writing, and frankly, I do it for myself because I enjoy doing it. But my real calling is to the people I'm with on a Sunday when we gather for the Lord's worship.
Yeah, I think that's important for us to always understand that. We don't want to shun the media entirely, but we do need to understand our calling. We do need to be more humble, understand, and not everyone wants to hear what we're going to say.
And I have to agree, at some level, there are men who have great influence because of sermons, because of audio sermons, because of the internet, and yet their congregations are not lively. And I'm not saying that, a healthy congregation is automatically going to be huge and lively, because, it takes the work of the Spirit of God and it takes time. But you do wonder about certain men who do a lot of conferences and their churches are not very vibrant, that they're spending so much of their energy on everything outside. And you wonder if they're not trying to reach the local community through the local church by spending most of their time there. And I think that is a real danger.
Yeah. I mean, Luther is a great example of this because obviously he's a world-famous and influential figure. But what drove him to Reformation? It was the fact that there was some cheap huckster selling indulgences in the neighboring parish to members of his church. It was because he cared for the local people that actually he was catapulted onto the world stage. He never sought that. What he was trying to do was look after the local people that the Lord had placed under his care. So Luther's a great example, I think, of, he's a famous, world-famous guy, but he never aspired to be that. He just wanted to be a good pastor.
Now, speaking, Nick just brought this up, but in terms of the culture of celebrity, we certainly have one that's alive and well, even in Reformed circles. Who were the types of people that people looked up to? What was the form of entertainment during the Reformation? What did people go do when they wanted to be entertained?
Well, obviously in the 16th, 17th century, you have some great dramatists, people like Shakespeare and company. But I would say that preaching itself in the 16th and 17th century was seen as a form of entertainment by many. I mean, Luther becomes probably, you've heard me say this in class, Camden, Luther probably becomes the first pin-up of modern time. By the time you get to the Diet of Worms, there is a trade in Germany in Luther posters. I facetiously joke in class that if you've got a teenage daughter in the 16th century, the thing you most dreaded was not a picture of a long-haired rock star appearing on her wall, but a picture of this crazy monk from Wittenberg.
Yeah.
So Luther does become a kind of iconic celebrity figure, preaches to packed houses. If you look at the pamphlets and the woodcuts of that day, you can see that Luther and his opponents, depending on whose side you were on, were the great heroes and champions of the day. Famous woodcut of Luther dressed as Hercules. Here is the hero of the Reformation cast in the uniform of a hero of classical Greece. So Luther was most definitely a celebrity of his day.
There's a drawing of Luther that Albrecht Dürer actually did when they were together in the castle in Coburg, overlooking the city. Luther was in hiding. I think it was during the Augsburg, when the Augsburg Confession was being presented, and it really gives you something of an idea of how famous he was during that day, that this great artist would be there with him and drawing these portraits of him there.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
yes,
if Luther
the equivalent of having a top photographer.
Right. The paparazzi.
The paparazzi.
Do you have any advice for young ministers who are aspiring to have a writing ministry, or to have some aspect of writing involved in their ministries with regard to publications, if not internet work, otherwise? Do you have advice you give your students in this regard?
One of the things I say to my students is, I just say the first thing I do now when I get a job application for any job at Westminster, I Google the name. I want to see what these people have been up to on the internet. And if they've been unpleasant or offensive or behaved inappropriately, guess what? They don't make the shortlist for the job. So my advice to students is think very carefully about what you put up on the internet. I was very fortunate that my youth was spent at a time when the internet was not around. And I wrote some pretty stupid and bad things, but they're gone forever. On the internet, they live for all eternity, it seems. So be careful about that. I think be careful about how you express yourself. I was given advice years ago by an older Christian guy, a guy called Bob Horn, who was a real mentor to me back in the UK. Sadly, he died a few years ago. But Bob's comment to me was always, the problem always comes with the adjectives. When you write a piece of prose, be careful which adjectives you choose, because they can be some of the most destructive things you put down on the page. An argument can be turned from a good, powerful argument into a very vicious one by the inappropriate use of adjectives. So I think self-control and thought is key. I also think beware of how much time you waste on these things. I'm told, I don't have a Facebook account myself, but I'm told that Facebook can be an incredible consumer of time.
Oh, yeah.
Pastors and students need to ask themselves, is this an appropriate way to spend my time? How long is legitimate to spend on these things? Am I neglecting my family or my other duties because I'm typing up trivia on the internet? Yeah,
that's very helpful. But earlier on, you briefly mentioned the early church and the difference between the internet and the printing press. Obviously, being the internet is, of course, tending toward visual media now. The video seems to be taking over. If there was a shift from Christianity at its core, I'm convinced, and it has to be, is a word religion. Now, we have been given a visual media, if you want to call it that, in the sacraments. But we have been given, Jesus Christ is the Word, and faith is passed on by the preaching of the Word, the preaching of the gospel, and faith comes by hearing that gospel preached. But in the ancient church, for various reasons, people started worshiping or using icons and other types of media, visual media, in the worship of the church. But it seems like with the Reformation, was there the shift back towards word media? What happened to the visual forms, the visual representations, once the religion was back in the vernacular?
Well, in Lutheranism, the visual form continued, really. There is certainly a shifting of the pulpit back to the center of the church's life, often literally. The pulpit would be moved and put more central in the church building. But in Lutheranism, images remained intact. The aesthetics of Lutheranism are very similar to the aesthetics of medieval Catholicism. In Reformed religion, there was a great suspicion of the visual and an application of the Ten Commandments that really saw portraits or images of Christ as being illegitimate. So these were often smashed up and disposed of, as were stained glass windows.
Do you think that the internet is causing or contributing to a shift back towards visual forms in worship?
I certainly think it can't help. It doesn't help a word-based religion for a number of reasons. One, clearly, visual aesthetics are much more important on the web than typically they would be in a book of print, if you like. We're all aware of what web pages look attractive and which ones don't. Secondly, I think it's the nature of reading on the web that people read shorter sections and skim read. There isn't the same engagement with the text that you have if it's a book sitting in front of you. I still, for example, subscribe to the hard copy of the British magazine, The Spectator, because I like to sit down with a cup of instant coffee. I can't drink the American stuff. I like to sit down with a cup of instant coffee and read the magazine in a way that if I